what we're going to cover now is the modern theories of property. So we're going to be looking at the theory of property as it came into the modern era. You'll recall that one of the many transitions that happened between pre-modernity and modernity was the transition out of the feudal system through a process known as the enclosures into what can be called absolute private property rather than conditional private property. Now, we can't have a major change in something as important as our property institution without having a reason for it, without having some argument to say this is a good idea. This morning what we're looking at is some of the principles that underlie what makes a good or appropriate system of property. And what we need to do is see how those principles were then marshalled to give us a completely different approach. And so we're going to look at the way that that was actually carried out. Okay, we've mentioned that modernity is associated with what we'll call radical private property. And so this is very much this idea of absolute, radical in the sense of extreme. And that had to do with the removal of the obligations attached to property. There's a sense also that came into the modern mind of individualism. And to a large extent, that's very much the anthropology that we work with right now. By anthropology, I mean the theory of the human person that we're using at present. When we talk to each other, when we sit down and have a cup of coffee or something, we talk about something that somebody has done which might annoy us or that we think is fantastic, but it might have annoyed somebody else. One of the foundations that we don't necessarily mention is the fact that we're both working our evaluations on the basis of our shared understanding of what it is to be human, our anthropology. In our world today, we see ourselves as individuals. An expression that Carl Zimmerman used, which kind of encapsulates this to a certain extent, has to do with our relationship with our families. One of the things that I found a little surprising when I was kind of fairly green to this academic business, when I was giving lectures and stuff and dealing with classes and trying to get my head around the names of 100 people in a class and that sort of stuff. You'd get an email, or in those days it was more likely a telephone call, and someone would ring you up and they'd say, "Hello, this is Sue, when is the assignment due?" And I'm thinking, I'm teaching 3 subjects, I've got at least a dozen Sues. Do you have a last name? Because Sue would be of the opinion that her family wasn't really important. She was an individual. Because in our culture, we are individuals. We don't really see ourselves as connected in any serious way to a family. In the Eastern cultures, one of the things which impressed me, I was working in Singapore at one stage, and the respect that young people have of, say, a Chinese background or other parts of Southeast Asia, for their family is so great that they will introduce themselves by their family name before their personal name, out of respect for their ancestors. Okay? Now, we live in a very individualistic kind of culture. Now, that is what it is, but it's something very important. Most cultures in history don't see themselves that way. Now, it's very difficult for us to come to grips with that because it's simply the air we breathe. It's what we're amongst. Individualism came into the West with modernity, and to a certain extent, if you think long and hard enough about the Machiavelli's prince, you can see that the prince really was an individual. He wasn't in solidarity in some sort of like a family relation with his kingdom. The prince was really there to get his best results at the expense of those he governed, which is the antithesis of the kind of relations that you find in a family. When Carl Zimmerman in 1947 was writing Family and Civilization, he said that one of the things you notice at the end of a culture's period of civilizational dominance is that people only belong to families as long as is biologically necessary. And so kids will leave home and leave any sense of obligation to their families once they're big enough and whatever to have enough kind of income to be able to leave home. And likewise, husbands and wives only hang around for long enough to have their emotional or physical needs met, and as soon as that doesn't happen, they split. Most cultures don't do that. But in an individual culture, individualist culture like ours, that's pretty much the dominant approach. And so when you walk down the aisle and say, I do, are you saying I do for the rest of your life, or I do until I'm simply sick of you? And living in a individualistic kind of culture, it's probably more likely the latter. Again, a contrast, say, between us and the Chinese culture. For those of you who aren't Chinese in the room, one of the things which differs is that we persist in, say, getting married to people we fall in love with first. Whereas in many parts of the Chinese world, people will get married and then they'll fall in love because their parents may have organised the people they're going to get married to. Now, we tend to think that's a horrible thing, but I'm told that their marriages last a lot better than ours, and typically husbands and wives get along a lot better because they understand the cultural obligations that are associated with that institution. We've left this behind. Now, that's all hidden behind the word individual or individualism. But all early modern property theory is tied up with commercial individualism, because that would say that my property is mine, and one of the conditions of my property is that you cannot come on it. You can't sort of visit it. You can't walk across it. I'm not sure if it's the case now, but some years ago I did a fairly long camping trip across Asia into Europe. And one of the curious things there was that you could put your tent almost anywhere in India or Nepal or Afghanistan, and you know, people would come out and they'd talk to you and all that sort of stuff, and it wasn't really a big deal. Once you crossed over from Turkey into Europe, suddenly you had to go to a camping ground and you had to pay fees, and you sort of couldn't go and simply drive the truck over someone's paddock. People would come out and they'd sort of sometimes have all sorts of firearms and stuff and chase you around. Whereas the Asian mentality simply isn't like that, because there's just not this notion of absolute individualism. There's more of a sense of, you know, if I'm not using the back paddock, then you're welcome to put your tent on it, this sort of thing. So we see that coming in at the beginning of modernity. Caveat emptor in trade, let the buyer beware. This idea that the seller has got no obligation, no solidarity, no sense of social connection with the buyer. The buyer is somebody that you unload your damaged goods on and try and trick them into believing that they're okay, and it's up to them to work out that they're being tricked or not. It's a very different social relationship to what you find, say, in Indigenous people and so on. Okay. One of the big problems that modernity had was that on one hand, especially those who had some kind of limited property rights suddenly wanted to have absolute property rights. So you had a feudal lord who didn't want to pay rent to the king, and he had all these commons that he wanted to enclose so that he could charge rent. And the rent he charged, he wanted to charge it not the way that you would charge, say, a family, excuse me, you would charge a family member, but rather that you would charge some alien that you simply wanted to exploit to the hilt. And so rents were being pushed up, land was being enclosed, and the minimisation of the obligations associated with private interests in land the obligations were being minimised. Now the question was, we can understand fairly easily the obligations that are natural to property. Aristotle did it, Aquinas did it, Bonaventure did it, and others. How do we justify moving into absolute private property when we say this thing is mine, it's mine, it's mine, and I can rip you off? In fact, I can cause your death by my right to exclude you. This morning when we were talking about, if I had private rights to all the air in the world, that sort of thing. So there's a question. And the second question is how to compute the land rents. Because now again, the land rents were not worked out as part of some sense of social cohesion, but rather some form of profit maximisation. One of the first attempts at doing this, and this is mainly to do with the land rent. William Petty is considered to be one of the early modern economic theorists, and he wrote about a number of things. I'm going to look particularly at his approach to setting land rents. And the problem is that if you have a labour theory of value, and we saw in the very first class, that leaves us high and dry when it comes to putting a value on land, because it's got no labour content. And so the rent it's just had this major problem. There's no labour in land, therefore how do you charge for it? And that established or set in motion the question, the puzzle of the relationship between the return to land and the return to labour, what we've been describing as the problem of distribution. And in Petty's world, that was described as the problem of the par. Some of you may play golf and you're familiar with what a par is. It's a way of basically relating two different things together, two different players in the case of golf. What's the relationship between land and labour in terms of how well it should get paid? The problem of the par. This sort of comes into the question of land value because land rent, one way or another, is prior to land value, which is the point here. To get the value of land, we capitalise its rent, and that really means that the prior question, the first question, is the question of rent. So what did Petty do? Petty took an approach which I would say is based on common practice. He said, well, we have a common practice of land being sold from one person to another and a price being put on it. That's simply a practical reality. It's a fact of the world as we encounter it. So we have the land value coming first, at least in Petty's view. And then Petty said, well, we can compare land rents to the rent on money. Now, we did mention, I think, when we were talking about Islamic economics, that the question of interest on money loans is itself a fairly major ethical question. And many cultures in history and across the world have considered that interest on a money loan is something which is not moral, it's unethical. But in Petty's world, bankers were charging interest, and Petty reasoned like this: if it's possible to take interest on money, then that gives you a rate of return, what we would think of in property circles as a yield. And if I can get from the capital value to the annual payment by applying the yield percentage, then if I know the value of the land, then I'll be able to work out the rent simply by applying something similar. And he said, well, money and land are fairly similar, and therefore the yields I'm going to apply are going to be fairly comparable. And so if I'm getting a 5% return on money, then I'd expect maybe a 5% return on land. Petty hadn't really engaged with the capital asset pricing model and the sort of stuff we do in finance these days. But, it was a start, and it was a start back in the 17th century, and that really set in motion this idea. So for Petty, not only can you own land, but you can work out the rent on it because of the similarity between money and land. It doesn't really get us very far, into the question of how we get to own land in the first place. Back at that stage, there was still a fairly strong idea that this question had to be solved by some sort of a recourse to nature, to what is natural, to what could be known with certainty about the nature of things, the metaphysics, if you like. So along comes Hugo Grotius. Grotius comes along about the same time as Petty, different part of Europe, and Grotius wanted to apply what's known as natural law theory, law or moral decisions, ethical decisions, based on some kind of a understanding of the way that the world is, the metaphysics of it, what actually existing. And so you've got this natural law theory. Grotius argued along these lines. He said, one way or another, people must occupy the land in order to live. We've got to have some place to lay our head at night. We've got to have some place to plant our crops. We've got to have some place to occupy for our workshops. And the fact that a farmer might take a paddock, sow it with corn, necessarily means that somebody else can't go along and sow it with oats or run sheep on it or what have you. And so the fact of human nature, which is the need to occupy land, necessarily excuses others from it. As a result of that, land property is natural as a consequence of living. Now, there is a delightful logic to this. And Grotius said, well, therefore, people have to have private property because people need land. And that was considered sufficient at the time. Grotius is still considered to be one of the early modern natural law theorists to give us a theory of absolute private property. If we look a little bit closer, we find that Grotius is really substituting or doing a little bit of a sleight of hand between ownership and occupation. I might occupy a house as a tenant. I might be renting it. In our world, that's not considered to be an owner. But my needs are still met. I can still go home every night. I might have the keys so that other people aren't allowed to go into it and all that sort of stuff. And there's my bed and my kitchen and da-di-da-di-da. I'm more of an occupier of the land rather than an owner. But there are really two different things going on here. We're talking about ownership because ownership is what enables the landlord to charge the rent for somebody whose physical needs causes them to occupy a piece of land. So Grotius's insight that people need land in order to survive certainly gives you justification for maybe marking out a block of land or some boundary around the place where you say, yes, this belongs to Patrick, this belongs to Bill, this belongs to Pete. Okay? But it doesn't actually justify Fred charging rent from George and Harry driving out Pete because they're trespassing. So in a sense, how can you have trespassers using Grotius? At least in many cases. So there's a kind of a bit of a sleight of hand there. And especially the question of absentee landlords. For those of you who have read the readings in Islamic economic thought, you'll find there's a kind of similarity here in Islamic thought, except that the pure Muslim thinking, Islamic thinking on this would say that yes, I have needs to occupy land because of the nature of what it is to be human, and so I might have the right to have a place to have my house, or a paddock for my animals, or a field to go and plant my crops. But once I've finished sort of harvesting my crops, or once my animals have sort of moved on and somebody else has moved on, my property rights disappear. Okay, so the Islamic thought, I think, is interesting because it really comes back as a kind of a very powerful criticism of Grotius's attempt at a natural law theory. John Locke came along in his two treatises on government and attempted also a natural law theory. Locke took a slightly different view to Grotius. It was sort of related in some ways, that like Grotius, he recognised that there are knowable things about human nature that cause us to have some call on particular blocks of the Earth's surface to be ours. And so it's also a natural law theory. But Locke focused on the labour invested in the land. And his argument would be that if somebody invests labour into land, then there is something of themselves, naturally, metaphysically, in the land, which then means that it's an injustice to the person if they don't have title to their investment of themselves, given that labour is in a sense a kind of manifestation of your own life, which is something very few people argue you actually own yourself. And so the labour invested in the land makes private land ownership essential for one's own effort. It also resonates with the Islamic theorists and so on, to a different conclusion, to the extent that unlike the Islamic thought that would say the title dissolves once the labour content has been harvested, Locke would say that the labour gives you a permanent right to the land. And that's particularly evident when you then rent your land to somebody else who is then putting their labour into it and paying you rent. We can look at John Locke's theory as explaining part of the land title. And this actually helps us to understand the problem of distributive justice, that distribution between land and labour and perhaps capital. And it would give you a theory, I think, to extend Locke rationally, where the person contributing labour has title to the labour content in the land, maybe the seeds growing or the cleared sort of forest or the fences or what have you, and then somebody else may own the land itself. And so you get this idea of joint title proportion to the labour contribution, but still with the remainder of the property kind of still common. And because it's common, naturally, whatever commercial economic value comes from that, somehow the community has an interest in or a right to some of the benefit. Okay, so if I'm there farming, or if you're farming, you plant your crops, or you care for your cows, your crops and your stock flourish, and you go and sell them, you live comfortably. Some of the income you get from selling your cows or selling your corn or what have you is definitely yours because of your labour. Some of it comes from just the natural character of the land itself. And that part is still part of the common wealth of the community. Yes, sir?
So, I was just saying, if you own a property and you rent it out to someone, they're the ones who are renting the property are going to put labour into the land. So is he saying that the tenants should ultimately be the owners? Is that what this?
Well, this is the kind of question, okay, what you're asking is, when we split things up between the tenant putting the labour in and then the landowner being someone else, what seems to be lurking in the shades here is that the tenant kind of actually owns the land more than the landlord, potentially. Right? These are the kind of issues, right? And it's an important thing to give thought to, because Locke would really say that maybe the tenants do. What Locke would say, though, is that if I come into some, piece of land where, terra nullius, there's no one owning it. If I come in, it's nobody's, I have no right to it. But if I come onto that terra nullius land and put labour into it, so I plant the crops, then at the end of the year I harvest those crops, the land is still mine. And so Locke is using this as a strategy for taking permanent rights in the land based on the labour of the initial investment.
Okay, yeah.
Right? And the real problem is, you see, in the 18th century and later, and probably earlier as well, people weren't really interested in that kind of a split up because they wanted to be able to take the benefit of the land well after their initial labour investment kind of has been dissolved, amortised, whatever. So the real goal here is taking the contribution which is of the land, not as a result of labour, privately. That's really the goal, and it's still the goal today. I mean, if we're in property development, for instance, really what you're doing is taking the planning uplift that comes as a result of a change in land use, right? Now that's something that naturally belongs to the community, whereas the developer, you're not a builder, so you want the development profit, which is well above what the builder's profit would be. And you guys have done building profit, relatively modest, lower risk, developer profit, considerably greater. But where does that come from? It really comes from the change in planning rights. It's a community thing. This is the stuff that's kind of lurking in the background of this. Okay, what we see with Locke, though, is the same with Grotius. Different argument, but it comes with the same conclusion. Locke does take the debate a little bit deeper, because whereas Grotius was simply looking at the fact of human need to occupy space, Locke is actually adding in, if you like, the commercial, the economic dimension of labour. What Locke doesn't do, however, is really consider how much labour, or whose, was required to secure the title. And so Locke would be comfortable with the idea that if I had my servant actually sow this new virgin terra nullius kind of block of land, it still becomes mine because that's my servant. So I've got all these complex questions about labour title with servants and so on, and you end up with quite a complex thing. But in a sense, you see, if the servants are out there ploughing the fields for Mr. Locke, then perhaps the servants are actually ending up with the natural title, or at least John Locke's modern natural title to the land. So it got to be a little bit of a muddle. But at least then you put this notion of labour in it, and it did kind of resonate with a lot of the political economy that was going on at the time. Just as a little bit of an aside, this question of who owns, if labour does infer some interest in the land, then that is potentially one of the arguments for taking apart the feudal system, and it was actually applied in the case of Japan post-Second World War. But that's, if you like, taking us off in a bit of a tangent. Let's move along to Smith. Smith, really the height of the Enlightenment, so after John Locke and Grotius. Smith, I think, could see through the limitations of Locke's theory, and so he could see that the labour content theory of Locke was faulty, because it simply didn't quantify it and it made a permanent interest out of something that was only transient. Smith took a different position. Now, I think I mentioned earlier on that the Enlightenment period was marked by an ethical theory known as the moral sentiment theory. And that would say something is ethical if it feels right. And largely Smith applied something very much like a moral sentiment theory to this question, when he basically focused on the fact that in England, in his part of history, people felt comfortable with private property. They'd been using private property in the, at that point for about 200 years or so it was kind of fairly familiar. People weren't sort of getting too upset about it. They simply accepted it as a fact of the way that English life was. And so Smith's approach is particularly modern in terms of the way that modern philosophy works. Modern philosophy is based on observation, on empiricism. And so things are seen in terms of, conclusions are made in terms of what is experienced, what is seen, what is heard, what is touched. And if you see people with an institution of property that consists of radical, like absolute private property, then the fact that it's there means it's there. And if it's there, it's okay. And if people aren't going to war over it, which they weren't in England, it must be okay because everyone accepts it. So it's an idea of truth by common opinion, or popular opinion. And so from Smith, you end up with the idea, or the maxim, if you like, that property is no more than that institution that gives rights of possession to persons under the sanction of the state. What that's saying is that property rights are simply those things that are upheld by the government, and after all, the government has all the military and police strength. And whatever institution of property the government upholds, that's the system of property. Now, from an intellectual point of view, that's a description of a property institution. It's not a theory or an explanation of a property theory. Okay? So it's descriptive. It's simply a positive observation of some kind of a correlation. That's pretty much the way that, or the pinnacle of Enlightenment thought with relation to property rights. The problem with Smith's theory is that, as I say, it's not really a theory. It focuses on common social practice. It could be that there'd be a different culture somewhere, or a different society, or a different point in time where common practice is different. So do we have a better one or a worse one? Well, Smith actually prevents us from saying that one system of property is better than another. All he allows us to say is that in England in the 1770s we had a particular institution of private property. In Australia in the 21st century we have a slightly different one, and they're there. You can't say that private property in England in 1770 was any better or worse than property in Australia in 2018. For that matter, it's no better or worse than property was in Scotland or France in the year 1200 or any other period in history. And so what people like Zimmerman and others have noticed about the correlation between inappropriate property rights causing civilizations to rise or fall becomes totally impossible to say under Smith. So what we were talking about earlier on when we talked about the way that the poor old Romans would come home from fighting in the war to find that they'd lost their farm because of their property institution, under Smith you simply can't make that observation. It becomes invisible. The advantage of Enlightenment thought in many places is that it does tend to make individualism and common practice far more acceptable because it almost prevents discussion on theory. And this leads to an approach to law, which is also very positive. Positive in that sense that I defined earlier, where positive means to position something, to put something there. The fact that a law exists is the only theory that we have about why it is there. We could talk about positive law and natural moral laws another time. But one way or another, we have this curiosity where the fact that something is legal is now the definition of why it is just. And so there's no such thing as an unjust law. There's no such thing as unjust terms of compensation. Because if the law does it, it must be right, under Smith. Most people would be of the opinion, if they stand back and think about it, that the legal system should reflect justice, not define it. And likewise, the legal system should be a reflection of the common belief in the community about the moral principles. Again, not defining them. But under Smith, you actually have this being inverted. Okay, now, under Adam Smith, you have extreme absolute private property happening in the late 1700s. And this was at the time when England was the strongest, the most powerful economic power in the world. And it really was a world empire. The sun had never set on the British Empire. It was extraordinarily wealthy. But oddly enough, in the backyards, if you like, of this country that ruled the world, most Englishmen, and by most I mean the majority numerically, were dreadfully poor. They were so poor they were destitute, to the extent that they were willing to steal and risk extraordinary fines and punishments simply to keep themselves and their children alive. Something would say there is something amiss with that, but under Smith's system of property, you couldn't actually say anything, and nothing was said. You had Lord Blackstone, who was also worth, and you can Google up Lord Blackstone and his commentaries on the laws in England, and I can only paraphrase the quote, but he says something like, property is that despotic dominion that one man holds over another with respect to land. Again, you guys will be able to find it with a Google search for quotes. Lord Blackstone, commentary on the laws of England, and this despotic dominion. It's really quite a powerful saying. Now, Blackstone, by the way, was not criticising the laws in England. He was simply stating that's the way they worked. That once you had property rights as an Englishman in the 1700s, you had the right of almost life and death of anybody who came onto your property. And certainly the right to exploit them economically. And exploitation was a fairly big feature of the 18th century in England, at least between those who had property rights and those who didn't. And this led up to the reaction. Now, I've already mentioned the reaction of socialism, and we've talked about Proudhon and the way that if the private property of Lord Blackstone and the likes of Adam Smith is resulting in all of these bad results of large-scale destitution despite extraordinary economic success, then private property must be bad, and then you end up with the unfortunate response to the other extreme, that common property must be good, and therefore all land should be common, and you end up with communism. So what do we do? Oh, hang on, I've lost the slide here. Might be coming back to socialism, I hope, because we need to take socialism apart a little bit further to actually look at where its weaknesses are. In the 20th century, this debate has continued. We've gone past the 18th century with Adam Smith. We've gone into the 19th century with Karl Marx, the capitalists giving way to the communists, and then back into the 20th century. And here are three fairly notable commentators on property theory in the 20th century. Milton Friedman is probably the best known. He was a Nobel Prize winner. Michael Novak is a writer on economics and the ethics of economics in the 20th century. I think he might have passed away now. And Bethel, likewise an American conservative writer, arguing for private property. Now, these three men are all writing from slightly different perspectives. but they all have a very similar approach and to similar conclusions, and so I'll put them all together for brevity. Friedman, Novak and Bethel, in their various books, all appeal to the successors of property. So unlike Smith, who simply says it is, therefore it is, Friedman comes along and says, well, not only is it, but it brings about all these wonderful results. In fact, if you look at GDP per capita through the capitalist era, you find that it's been going ahead, going ahead, going ahead. It's a marvellous thing. And so if the property system, which is associated with rising GDP per capita, it must be a good thing too. And so Friedman and others give us a defence of private property, radical private property, absolute private property, on the basis of the fact that it leads to economic success. In one way or another, England in the 18th century was an economic powerhouse. It was extremely successful. But what we noticed in the 18th century with England was that GDP per capita ignores wealth polarisation. If you have, let's say, 50 families in England who have it going into their pockets, pouring into their pockets, 95% of the GDP of England, which is not far off what was happening, while the rest of the 95% of the Englishmen were sitting around there having to steal apples off neighbours' trees in order to survive, then something is not going terribly well. Friedman, Novak, Bethel and others simply ignore wealth polarisation. And they tend to emphasise freedom. And so you'll find a common theme in 20th century conservative writing is the importance of freedom as the solution, and going in and fighting wars in the Middle East in order to bring freedom and democracy. Freedom becomes, if you like, the foundation piece for all that is good and true in a society. Now there's a distinction that we can make between freedom as defined by people like Adam Smith, David Hume, Voltaire, Rousseau, which I'll call Enlightenment freedom, and, if you like, another approach to freedom which you find in the thinking of other cultures and other systems of thought. We can think of freedom in two ways. The apparent definition of freedom is the absence of restraint. Okay? What does it mean to be free? It means that nobody's telling you what to do. Nobody is putting a law in front of you. And so the more freedom I have, or the less restraint I have, or the less restraint I have, the more freedom I have, and that's a wonderful thing. In some cases, that's a good thing. However, you guys are probably a little bit, if you had children, right? Especially sort of teenage children, but really even if you had sort of 4-year-old or 5-year-old children, if you're running a household with kids, let's imagine you've got 4 kids and they're all sort of primary age, and let's imagine we say, well, in order to have the most pleasant kind of life, as a parent, I'm going to let my kids have the greatest freedom. I think my kids would go to school. You think they'd practice to, become really good at soccer or basketball or some sport? You think they'd wake up early in the morning to do an extra hour of violin practice or piano practice? Would they, practice art or mathematics or anything else? Okay? That kind of Enlightenment thinking, when it's applied to a society, assumes that you've got people with the self-discipline to be able to apply themselves to worthwhile tasks, because simply having an absence of restraint, given the frailties of human nature, we tend to get a bit slack and sloppy. I'm trying to convince some older teenage boys at present that they ought to do a bit of sensible reading even though they've left school, and they don't have to. And that's probably because I'm an academic and I value learning. But, they sort of find a lot of time has to be spent on Facebook and doing all sorts of stuff, but their education isn't really getting a great deal deeper. Enlightenment freedom has disadvantages because over a period, when you have Enlightenment freedom in a culture, you tend to end up with cultural decay. That's why the Romans forgot how to make concrete, because over a period of time everyone was so busy being free, sleeping in, not doing very much work, not sort of learning very much, that they only did the things that were really, really important. And who needs to know how to make concrete anyway? I'm having a good time. And before you know it, they were simply stacking sort of stones on each other and not making sort of, stone buildings the way they had done before. Okay. There is another definition of freedom. And definition of an alternate approach to freedom is that freedom is the freedom to excel, the freedom to be. Okay? And a way of understanding this question sort of gets you a little bit closer to what distinguishes, somebody who just kind of mopes around and somebody who wants to make themselves, say, an Olympic athlete. Okay? What does an Olympic athlete do? He's got the freedom to wake up early in the morning, probably before dawn, go out, sort of run a few kilometres, come back, sort of, eat a very limited diet, watch every aspect of his day, how much sleep he gets, what he wears, what sort of, all sorts of stuff. Okay? But as a result of that, he's able to excel. And you see similar things with other places as well. The freedom to be, the freedom to excel, is where we get the notion of liberal arts from. If you do a BA over at Sydney University, okay, what do? You swan around the place, drink a lot of coffee, and read about Plato and all that sort of carry on. And I'm kind of getting you guys. I'm trying to get you guys excited about doing a little wee tiny bit of Plato. But that's what a liberal arts degree is. Okay, why do people persist in that? Why is it that our oldest, our Sandstone University in Sydney, still persists in getting people to do that? The reason is that being aware of those things actually helps people to get to a higher level in their humanity, to be able to plumb these interesting and deep questions. It's really a big part of what we're doing in this subject overall. I'm giving you the freedom to understand things that otherwise you wouldn't access, right? So there are these two different approaches to freedom. The Enlightenment freedom, the freedom from restraint, versus the freedom to excel, the freedom to be the best human you can be. Okay, the other thing which we find that makes the system work, that Novak, Friedman and Bethel are advocating, and De Soto for that matter, and you've probably come across De Soto in your property theory, and Coase. They give you an argument for property theories or property institutions, but the economic system that they use needs expanding markets. And this was largely why we've had an era of colonialism. That's why countries like China today are doing very well economically, because basically they're doing a form of economic colonisation of the rest of the world at present. That's a complex story for another time, perhaps. And what we've seen through the capitalist era is this dependency, and almost an addiction to expansion from the local to the national to the multinational scale. And capitalism, unfortunately, doesn't work when you've got a stable state. When we run out of global opportunities, then it basically runs out of steam. Okay. One of the things that you find amongst these authors, and De Soto is probably one of the most interesting authors, is that there is a very aggressive push to cause other cultures that have alternate property institutions, to convert to the radical private property institution, supposedly with the view to their economic benefit, but really the economic benefit is largely something which is going to return to the parent culture. Friedman, Novak, Bethel, all writing from the Anglo tradition, all wanting the rest of the world to turn into an Anglo type of culture, basically so Anglo economics does better. There is a very interesting book. The name of the author escapes me for the moment, it might come to me as we're going through this. The title is a little bit sensational. It's the Diary of an Economic Hitman. It's written by an international economic consultant that worked in a number of developing countries. A very interesting book because it tells the story of a chap who did very, very well convincing third world countries to take first world economic aid, basically for the benefit of the first world donors and ultimately to the impoverishment of the developing countries. The economic hitman stuff. It annoys me that I've forgotten the author's name. Let's move now into the 20th century. 20th century is this tussle between the two approaches, both modern, but both faulty, that developed in the centuries leading up through modernity. On the left, we've seen Marxism developed, and while at present it tends to be in eclipse, it's still behind a lot of our thinking. And for those of you who are interested, I mentioned earlier on that Marx was more of a social theorist than an economic one. We normally think of Marx as being associated with communism and all those bad things, but Marx would see himself probably more as having a broader theory of human society. In amongst Marx's broader theory of society, economics is certainly very, very important, but he sees himself as doing something a bit broader. For that reason, I would recommend, if you want to take this a little bit further, and I do recommend some of you, especially more thoughtful people in the class, look at reading more in the area of cultural Marxism. I won't go into that here, but it certainly adds an important dimension to this question of how Marx, I would say, is still developing. We might have the Russian Federation sort of winding back on its communism and the Chinese doing the same. But to really understand what Marxism's thrust into the modern world is, read about cultural Marxism. Some stuff on cultural Marxism is sort of disguised capitalism, unfortunately, but a lot of it does explain a lot of the peculiarities of our culture and where it's going. Okay, on the right we've had Smith developed, and Smith has really developed into neoclassical economics. Friedman, the monetarists, is probably the most extreme area or version of that. Neoliberalism, sometimes called now. Bethel and what's the other fellow, Novak, they're all really descendants of Smith. And what we're finding is that during the 18th century, the level of wealth polarisation tended to be wound back somewhat as a result of the threat of socialism. You certainly see that in the 19th century. Benjamin Disraeli, Bismarck in Germany, both political leaders who were saying, look, we better wind back the excesses here because otherwise the communists will basically take over. And there was this fear which caused the excesses of capitalism to be wound back in that period. And that's pretty much a process which has continued into the 20th century, probably up until the first half of the 20th century, that the threat of communism caused the condition of labour, the level of wealth inequality to actually be reduced. However, this side of, let's say, roughly the Second World War, the balance has gone back again. Certainly this side of about 1970, we see from the 60s somewhere, wealth polarisation has started to move the wrong way, and move the wrong way in a fairly substantial direction. To the extent that between 1970 and about the year 2000, and I haven't kept track of the data since then, it was noted that just about all occupations, with the exception of financial related, like accountancy, finance, and law, most professions actually went back in terms of their effective incomes. Certainly you can see this with engineering. An engineer was a respected and well-paid job in the 40s, 50s, 60s. By the time you get to today, engineering is something that you do for the love of mathematics or something. You don't do it because you're going to be able to feed your family very well. And so we're seeing these kind of unfortunate shifts in income relativities and wealth relativities kind of coming back into our culture as we speak. Also in the 20th century, we've seen customary property articulated. Now that's largely because of the indirect effects of the decay of the British Empire, also the effects that came as a result of the two world wars. Indigenous people have become more of a recognised force, and the era of colonisation is certainly on the back foot. That's probably been stimulated a little bit by Marxism. I think the way of thinking of customary people is fundamentally different to the thinking of either the political left or the political right. So we've got these three directions, sort of all developing and all arguing with each other through the 20th century. So the 20th century was a pretty interesting period, and we really haven't sort of come out of that too far. Although I think there's a kind of a sort of an intellectual fatalism which seems to be marking the 21st century, at least from what I can see in reading around the place. They're not the interesting and exciting ideas that were being batted around in the early 20th century. Yes, sir?
You mentioned in the 1800s or the 19th century that the capitalism, they sort of feed Marxism, they pulled it back a bit, their capitalism, and then
Yes.
they managed to decolonize the world to an extent. What sort of policies did they do to do that? Was that more cultural or?
It was probably at the level of the interest of politicians to push either way. And so when you had sort of debates over whether to have better work conditions, also relative wages through the 20th century. So your question is, what actually practically happened as the right-wingers became more afraid of the left-wingers and so on. You had a degree of political organisation starting at the end of the 1800s, end of the 19th century, and that meant that while we had these institutions like, democratic government and so on, the Labor side really only came out at the end of the 19th century. You didn't have a Labor Party in Australia. The side of about, I think, 1890 something, Labor Party got started. Similar thing in other parts of the world, in England, America, and so on. And also, there's the depth of political will. One of the things which is really interesting is that in Australia, our dole, being paid for not working, unemployment relief, I think it was the dole. It was either the dole or the old age pension was introduced by Menzies. Now, Menzies was an absolute right winger. And yet he brought in something which would normally associate with a left-wing, a Labor government, something like that. And the reason for that was that they sort of realised that they just really couldn't, squeeze the Labor too far without really having major problems. So is that sort of answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Last thing about it is that when we wrap up, I've been saying a lot of nice things about customary people on and off through these talks, but one of the things that you do see with Indigenous people is that you don't see Indigenous people necessarily driving around Rolls Royces. They tend to be associated with economic underdevelopment and so on. So we need to get our head around that. One of the practical problems with Indigenous people is that they tend to have a really good idea of the importance of leisure. And so once the work has been done to be able to survive for the day, they simply put their feet up and tell stories. I don't mind that as an idea. I mean, I kind of work a day job and then I sort of come home and answer my emails and do all sorts of stuff. And then sort of, you've got to cook dinner and clean up and whatnot. We work very long hours, whereas Indigenous people are very good at putting their feet up. Now, are they living better or worse than us? I don't know. It's certainly an interesting question. Because we tend to be so sensible that we're killing ourselves. Okay. When we look at the left and the right, Aristotle gave us a rather interesting principle for reviewing especially ethical issues. Vita stat media. Virtue stands in the middle. Virtue stands in the middle. I won't go into how vita stat media kind of works out, but you can kind of get the idea. Sort of extreme positions are often not good positions. And that would say that, is it left, is it right? Well, in fact, both of those are extremes, and therefore they're likely to be problematic. Okay? Virtue stands in the middle. Somewhere in the middle of those is probably going to be a better solution. In applying vita stat media to property, it comes back to what is now becoming a bit of a mantra, or a chorus through these reflections that we've been having: private ownership and common use. Not one or the other, but both. And we find that in what I would call classical realist property, sometimes referred to as moderate realist property. That's the philosophical term used to describe the thinking of people like Aristotle and his intellectual progeny, as opposed to the question that many people, or the way that many people pose the question of property today, and that is, are we going to have private ownership or common use, as though they're mutually exclusive. And sure enough, they're kind of opposites. But is it possible to have both, or must we have one or the other? There is a common theme, which I guess I've seen when you reflect on all the changes in all the different areas of human thought that you see through the ascendancy of modernity. And that is, modernity is pretty much distinguished by the tendency to turn a question of interest to humanity from a question of how to understand how two apparently complementary things both exist, to asking the question which one of two it will be. Is it this or that? So often, not just in property but many other parts of your life, the answers to the really hardest puzzle is not so much a matter of is something this or that, it's a matter of how do I do both. A little example, for instance, is coming along to class. Okay? Let's imagine I was running a bit late. I could come in with my hair all messed up and tie off and all that sort of carry on, and maybe mismatch your socks or what have you because I couldn't find them, and I might be here on time. And you guys would have to put up with the distraction of trying not to laugh at me all through class, right? But at least I'd be there on time. Alternatively, I could sort of look at the situation and say, okay, I like to be well presented when I come to class, therefore I'm just going to come late. So I might turn up half an hour late, but my shoes are shined and my clothes are straight and sort of shave for the day and all that sort of carry on, right? So what is it better? Is it to be better for me to come in looking presentable to you, or to be on time? Now, I think it's quite reasonable for you to probably say it should be both. If you're a bit stressed, well, one way or another, try and get as much of both of them as you can. You don't simply throw out one or the other. And okay, while I'm sort of giving the example from the perspective of me coming into class, it could be one of you blokes trying to, impress some sort of lady that he sort of fancies. And again, the same situation. Do you turn up for a date, after just sort of finishing your footy training a bit late, and you haven't had a shower, and sort of, the flies are following you and all that sort of stuff, and you haven't had a shave, and all that sort of stuff, right? And the dog's kind of taken the tail out of your pants, but you're on time, okay? Are you likely to impress your lady love? I mean, the ladies can give us a bit of an opinion on this. Or do you sort of sit there and have your shower and sort of polish your shoes and all that sort of stuff and turn up half an hour late, and she's twiddling her thumbs thinking, what kind of a goose? I'm hungry. I don't think I'll go out with this bloke again. Right? And again, you can work out what the solution is to that. Is it this or that? Or is it prudent to think about how do I do both of them? Those are just a couple of examples. Okay? And so many questions that we have in modernity tend to become because we try to divide what should be united. And we find that over and over again. In the case of property, getting in the way of Aristotle's dual theory of property only brings problems. Now, we've already talked about the customary title, so I'll just put this in for the purpose of completing the slides. You have all of those ideas, but I think what we might do is we'll take a little bit of a break now, maybe about a 5-minute break, so that we can come back and get the next class going. But that pretty much gives us, if you like, property theory now. We've broken it right up to the present. Okay, I haven't given you every theory, but I think I've given you most of the major ones. We've got the ancients under control, we've got the moderns under control, and now it's a matter of how you use that in your professional life. So let's take a break. I'll come back in probably, well, yeah, in about 5 minutes. Don't go away for long. I've got a fair bit to do this afternoon.